pair will have 20 minutes total to present, and we'll follow up those 3 presentations with questions at the end. So it's my pleasure to welcome our first group, Jen Sales, who is the Executive Director at Wheelchair Sports Alberta, and Ryan Van Koolen, who is also from Wheelchair Sports Alberta. So welcome.
So I'm going to be talking for most of this, and I got a cold like 2 days ago, so if you can't understand me, I'm sorry. Brad from Athletics Alberta wanted to be here, but he couldn't just because they have high school provincials this weekend, so I'll be doing a lot of the talking on this, and Ryan will chirp in when he's find something to talk about. So I started with Wheelchair Sports Alberta about 2 years ago, and the relationship between Wheelchair Sports Alberta and athletics at that time was really none. And so we had some silos going on within the para-athletics world in partnership with Wheelchair Sports Alberta at that time, but through the progression that we've been able to make, we actually have active para-athletes working within the able-bodied club, so a more inclusive scenario throughout the province right now. So initially when we started having collaborations and conversations, membership was a big conversation for us because if we wanted our athletes to be able to compete in some of the meets that Athletics Alberta is hosting, they had to have an Athletics Alberta membership. But then if they wanted to apply for our grants and stuff like that and have insurance through Wheelchair Sports Alberta, they had to have our membership. And so we had a conversation about how we're going to be able to eliminate some of the financial burden because it's just ridiculous to ask one person to take 2 memberships to play in one sport. And so with Athletics Alberta, basically took it on themselves and purchased a membership for everybody from their pool through Wheelchair Sports Alberta. So that was pretty exciting, just that first move in itself. And when we started our first summer, I think there was maybe 2 or 3 events that had para allowed in athletics, and now almost every single meet and event that Athletics Alberta is in partnership with has a para component. So we're offering a lot more programming. Another thing that was a huge barrier for us when we started is we had I think 4 track chairs and no throws chairs at all in the province. Ultimate Wheelchair in Calgary has quite a large number, but they were all being used, and we basically, there was a need for more equipment. And so last year we applied for the CIP grant, and we're fortunate enough to be able to get just under $68,000 towards athletics equipment. So that's what the big process that we're doing right now is purchasing equipment to be able to provide clubs with the necessary equipment to grow the sports in that situation. Recently, we just hosted a developmental camp as well as a coaching camp. So we flew in Uli, who's like the master track coach. He's just this wonderful guy and gave so much leadership to our coaches that were present. Again, we had low registration, but I mean, we had people getting the knowledge, and hopefully next year with more awareness and everything, it'll increase. Our partnership, I mean, we're in the same building, so it's a lot easier for us to be able to network when you're close to people, and it's not having phone conversations every week. We're having face-to-face conversations, and I think between our 2 organizations, we're functioning as one unit now, whether that be talking about Canada Games, or that's talking about what the schedule is going to look like for the year, or how we're going to get our athletes to certain events. It's all a collaboration conversation. We've also brought in Alberta Schools Athletics Association in on these conversations just because they have such a strong pool of athletes that they can get a handle on, where we might not necessarily have that same reach. Yeah, you got anything? No, that's Ryan. He's quiet. I'm not quiet. Yeah, I mean, that's about as much as I have to say, but it's been successful. It's really growing, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done.
So maybe I will follow up with a few questions then for you.
Okay.
So in terms of takeaways for people and how they can apply some of the changes that you're seeing with your organization with mainstream sport as well, what are some of those key things that you think can extend beyond your program to other programs as well?
Well, I mean, I think just in my experience, there's always been this defining barrier between the two like para and mainstream, and a lot of it has to do with financial burdens, because as a culture, I'm assuming it's a culture, parasports in the province has been very much a everything is free kind of mentality. But then if you go to mainstream sport, everything is pay to play. And so trying to find some sort of a barrier between those organizations where our para athletes, yes, are getting some financial burden taken off of them by hopefully Wheelchair Sports Alberta or whatever organization is being able to offer it. But then you're not impacting how Athletics Alberta is treating the mainstream athletes as well, right? Because it's not fair if they both end up going to nationals and one goes for free and one doesn't go for free. Like there is some resolution that needs to happen, and the conversation. And I don't know if we'll ever get there, but having the conversations, because you can't just not talk about money. It has to happen. It's a very critical part to having these kind of sports.
Okay. So yeah, the financial barriers, I think, are probably something that resonates with a lot of people in the room. Attitudes-wise, how has that worked in terms of those kinds of collaborations, the kind of awareness, learning that comes along with collaborating with mainstream sport?
Well, and I mean, so for Wheelchair Sports Alberta, we have 5 sports, and we have 5 national sport organizations, it's just a very interesting kind of structure to walk into. And attitudes, generally everybody wants it to happen. They want to find the success. They want it to see the programs grow and have more participation. And I think we all have the same ideas, but it's about everybody foresees it differently. And I mean, being an able-bodied individual, it is difficult sometimes to be able to have the hard conversations, because I don't know what my boundaries should be. But I mean, the more that I'm in the community, I feel the more I'm at least getting comfortable with some of the conversations around the culture. We've had to do some facelifts on culture change within Wheelchair Sports Alberta, whether that be from a coaching perspective or from an athlete perspective. But every day it gets better, and everybody, as long as they have the same goal in mind, I think we'll get there eventually. Just have to manage the waters.
Okay. So you mentioned that word culture, and so immediately I'm starting to think about the previous presentation where David Howe talked about the idea of the 51%. What does your organization look like in terms of that?
Our board is, actually I think we only have Dean on the board who's a para-athlete. And yeah, our organization is totally able-bodied, and it's hard, but it would be nice to have some growth that way, even in volunteers or whatever that would look like. Better representation for sure.
Are there particular ways you think that you can encourage that? Or support that, maybe, is a better word?
Yeah, I don't know what that would look like. As you'd almost have to make like a policy or something, kind of a mandate. But yeah, I mean, talk to whatever volunteer options that we can find. We just hosted Wheelchair Rugby Nationals in Calgary this past weekend, and I bet you we had about 30% were a para volunteers, and they were fantastic volunteers, but there were some positions that we struggled with. Our shot clocks, we had a few quads try and work our shot clocks, but the buttons on it were too difficult. They couldn't be able to push it, and trying to reorganize what kind of volunteer role they can have, but we made it work, and we had a ton of volunteers. They were fantastic.
Sounds like we need better shot clocks.
Oh, you have no idea. We had a horrible shot clock experience.
So another question I have for you, actually, because of the nature of your sport, and I'm thinking about the stuff I know about wheelchair basketball, do you have any reverse integration happening in Wheelchair Sport Alberta for athletics? So that's where people who are not disabled might be playing in or competing in chairs as well? Is that happening at all, or encouraged?
Basketball for sure. Athletics, not so much. The more I think that we go into the small towns, I'm hoping it's going to, because it is such an individual sport that people are going to want to compete that way. Tennis, however, tennis is really starting to step up their game that way. We have some very strong athletes in the province with tennis, and they're competing, or their membership at an able-bodied club, and they'll actually bring in other like able-bodied athletes to sit in a chair and play against them, just so they can get some better competition.
I was also thinking about this idea of parasport being a second option for people versus being a legitimate sport in and of itself, as like a sport is a sport kind of thing. So your experience with that reverse integration, has it been viewed as we're going to help out by playing in a chair, or we're going to get some good competition and we're all going to enjoy playing sport? How is it put across?
I think it's been some good competition. Like we had that gentleman that went to the Davis Cup. He was one of the high performance athletes competing at the Davis Cup in tennis, and he got into a chair and played against Kyle, and like it was laughable how bad he was, and he's one of the best tennis athletes in the world. And I think that maybe initially the thought would have been, this is just for a laugh kind of a thing, and try something new. But then afterwards, I think he really did appreciate the athleticism that went involved in it.
You also mentioned rural involvement and engagement. Can you speak a little bit to what you might be doing in rural contexts?
Yeah, so it's very difficult to have a team sport happen in rural Alberta because we just don't have the numbers to be able to put a team together. And so we're trying to really push for the individual sports in the rural areas. And because with athletics, any club can be able to support para-athletics as long as they have the coaching to back up what kind of a program they have. And so with this grant that we received, we're hoping that we can kind of disseminate some equipment into rural areas to be able to really bring those athletes or potential athletes to the sport that may or may not be playing any sport right now because they just don't have the resources.
And so that goes sort of along the lines with grassroots development.
Yeah.
And do you see specific partnerships that could occur within rural communities? I'm always thinking like schools are a natural partnership, but
Yeah, I think the schools are a huge partnership, and it's very difficult to get in with the schools, with the board specifically. But our relationship with Alberta Schools Athletics Association has really helped out that way, just in the sense that they have the contacts with the athletic directors of every school in the province. So yeah, I mean.
So are there any, I guess, collaborative outreach things that WSA does with schools or other organizations?
A lot of the
say
schools
no
try
by?
and bring us in, and it's so difficult to bring like 8 chairs somewhere just so that they can hang out in them for a few hours, but we make it work, and I think there's a lot more need for that than the resources that we have to be able to give. But a collaboration like we're trying to work out with Fort Mac, and because I think it would be a fair CIP grant to apply for to get some chairs in Fort Mac just so that we can run some programming, because they're so far away from resources, but there is still quite a large population there. And so we're communicating in that organization. We have PSA, we have Cerebral Palsy Sports, we've got the Fort Mac, what was that guy? The tourism guy. He came to our building and like brought us donuts and stuff one day. It was awesome. Yeah, it was a highlight. But and he was a huge success, and we run this Bridging the Gap event there, and we had like 40 people show up and ready to go, and we're like, crap, well now, just kidding, we showed you this awesome event, these things that you can do, but we're going to take all of our resources away. So now we got to go back and try and really evaluate what kind of sports they want to do, and see if we can apply for some grants strategically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else from athletics that you want to just share with the group? Any other thoughts? Well, you'll get another chance. But.
Yeah, I was like, it's getting off the ground. It's not where it needs to be yet, but hopefully we're on the right path right now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So my pleasure to invite our second group, Nathan Kinderchuk, who started the para-swimming program here at the Stedward Center. And then Nathan is currently head coach with the Olympic Swim Club still. Yes? Okay, good. Based in Edmonton. And Jessica Ferguson, who is the parasport lead here at the Stedward Center at the U of A. So welcome.
Thank you. So our partnership story began because Nathan was formerly the head coach of the Stedward Bears paraswimming team. And when he accepted the position with Olympian Swim Club, it opened some new and exciting possibilities for both of our organizations. So the Steadward Bears were looking for a way to increase the training intensity and training frequency for some of our para-swimmers who had specific competitive goals. We were also looking for a way to access sanctioned swim meets and for travel planning and implementation for out-of-city swim meets. All of these things are accomplished through our partnership with OSC. When Nathan left, we hired 2 coaches to fill his position with the swim team. So we have a head coach who works with our performance group or competitive group of swimmers, and we have an assistant coach who works with our development group and does a lot of the volunteer recruitment and training. It was a little bit of a rocky road hiring into these positions. The first individual that we had in the head coach position didn't work out within the first couple of months, but we have 2 wonderful individuals in the positions now. So Julia is our head coach. She formerly was a volunteer with the program as well as a practicum student with the Steadward Center. And Katrina is our assistant coach, and she formerly was a volunteer with the program. So we've set up this really great structure where students can gain volunteer experience throughout their degrees, and then potentially have the opportunity to move into paid coaching positions afterwards.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone. So Jessica's going to speak from the Steadward perspective, obviously, and I'm going to speak from the OSC perspective. So when looking again at our partnership story, the OSC Board of Directors, even prior to my involvement, was seeing the growth and development of para-swimming in Edmonton and in Alberta, and was interested in getting involved and trying to support the development of parasport, because they believe it was obviously something that, as a large swim club in Alberta, we're like top 5 in terms of size in Alberta, it was something we could actively do to increase inclusion, and it was good for the whole swimming community to be exposed to parasport. So obviously, when I came on board, I thought that was something really positive. From OSC's perspective, we run a lot of programming and registration processes and travel processes that basically will happen whether or not para-swimmers from the Steadward Center are included or not. So it's just about taking a little bit more time to include everybody when we're already going through the same processes. So it's really not much of an inconvenience for us to work with and collaborate with the Steadward Center athletes. I think, one of the important aspects of our relationship is that Swim Alberta has been actively supportive of our relationship, and they see that having kind of a pathway moving from the Steadward Center through to a more integrated context can develop and improve the capacity for the number of athletes we have and hopefully the quality of athletes, and they can make national teams and represent Canada internationally. And so kind of that's our partnership story, but we're also going to talk a little bit about what we share, some pros and cons of our relationship, some tips, and some other information. So back to Jessica.
So things that we share between our organizations, we share Julia, so she's the head coach of the Steadward Bears. She attends 4 practices a week with that team, as well as has a variety of administrative tasks. She's also the JOW coach with Olympian Swim Club and attends 3 practices a week with them. We share specific para-athletes between our clubs. We share competition registration. We share travel planning and implementation for those out-of-city meets. And we share insurance coverage through Swim Alberta.
Yeah. And so obviously we do share a lot of things, but there are some things we don't share. So I'm going to highlight those. The Olympian Swim Club manages bookings at 6 facilities. So the Steadward Center and OSC do all of their facility bookings and management completely separately because the Steadward Center works only out of the University of Alberta. The Steadward Center does not share any of their volunteers with the Olympian Swim Club. That could change in the future to support specific athletes integrating, but at this point, that's not what we're doing. Katrina, the development coach from the Steadward Center, is only working with Steadward Center athletes, though her insurance and registration is in part through OSC. We do have separate registration processes and fees for training, so we don't really share training other than a few integrated athletes. We do our own fundraising programs, and for the most part, we manage our own budgets and don't have much in the way of sharing finances. So moving on to some pros and cons of our relationship.
So some of the pros to our partnership would be that there are definitely athletes that benefit from being able to access the increased intensity and increased frequency of practice through OSC. There are multiple opportunities for integration partnering with a club such as OSC. They have 17 different training groups of different ages and skill level. Our head coach is able to attend swim meets through OSC registration. Stedward Bears swimmers are able to access swim meets. And what we've really done is create a pathway for paraswimmers. They're able to gain exposure to swimming at a grassroots level, and then we're able to support swimmers at a competitive level by offering these a la carte training sessions with Olympian Swim Club. This increases the number of paraswimmers within the province, as well as the speed of those paraswimmers. I think one of the biggest pros to our relationship is that both of our organizations are actually open to collaborating with each other, and there is the potential for a reduced cost to the Stedward Center.
Yeah. So there's lots of pros. It's really positive, and I think I'd like to just reiterate that the organizational focus on collaboration and openness to collaborate is what's really driving the success here. It's not common from what I've seen. So it's pretty exciting. However, there are some cons. So, of course, when collaborating and communicating very frequently about registration, travel, swim meets, and even training tasks, there is an increase in the amount and frequency of administrative tasks. And so it's important for both organizations to try and establish role clarity when managing all of the things that need to be completed. One thing that could be negative is that the Stedward Center staff have less control over swim meet processes, registration for those competitions, and fees, because OSC is kind of managing that side of the deal. But on the other hand, it is a responsibility that the Stedward Center does not have to manage at this point. So, it could be considered a pro or a con. Our relationship requires a lot of communication, and if we don't make time to manage that communication effectively, confusion can occur. One of the interesting challenges that I think we have is that both organizations have different orientations and values and missions. So just to kind of describe that for a second, the Olympian Swim Club is clearly defined as a sport club, and our mission is to create the best swimmers we can so that we are competitive in the province of Alberta and in Canada. All of our swimmers are required to participate in competition. We are not providing rec programming. And we want to develop specific aspects of character and positive things that can come from sport as athletes move through. Meanwhile, the Stedward Center is focused on developing sport, similar to OSC, but they also have other programs like adult programming and Free to Be Me and some other silos that they manage. So because the Stedward Center kind of has a broader portfolio, we have to make sure that we're working together well to achieve specific sport outcomes. One of the practical challenges or cons that we've had is that some athletes, rather than deciding to integrate, say, by going 3 or 4 sessions a week with Stedward and 1 or 2 with OSC, have decided either to stay completely with OSC or completely with the Stedward Center. And I don't think this is positive because some of those athletes could benefit from the specialized programming that the Stedward Center is providing, a higher ratio of coaches to athletes, coaches that are very focused on making appropriate adaptations in parasport, whereas in OSC, the ratio of coach to swimmer is usually 1 coach to 16 athletes, or maybe even more athletes, depending on the day and the situation, and it could be 1 coach to 2 athletes at the Stedward Center. So I think providing a few sessions a week with a higher level of support, maybe to focus more on technical swimming skills, and then 2 or 3 sessions a week to focus more on physiological outcomes like training, or cardiovascular fitness, for example, would be really beneficial to some of those swimmers. So we need to make sure that we're presenting and communicating the option to integrate in a way that people are willing to try so that they can benefit from that structure. And I guess one of the challenges that athletes face when they're going to be involved in integration is their social experience. So as Jessica said, there are 17 training groups in OSC. That's really loud. All right. Oh, but it's warm in here. Maybe we'll cool off. So because we have 17 training groups, we have the ability to cater programming somewhat to the specific needs of para-athletes, but we also only offer programming for basically 7 or 8-year-olds up until they graduate high school, 17 or 18. There are many para-swimmers and para-athletes that don't end up involved in sport until after that age. And so if we're going to be integrating people into a swim club, we need to be very careful about how we manage their, I guess, opportunity to be social with their peers, their coaches, volunteers, and everybody else. So that's enough about cons.
So some next steps for the Stedward Center, just building off of what Nathan was speaking about in this last point here, is to look for ways for more strategic integration of some of those athletes who have maybe been hesitant to take full advantage of our partnership. We'd like to see some of the athletes of the Stedward Bears form small cohorts and choose a day of the week that they can go to OSC and attend a swim meet together to hopefully make that environment a little bit more comfortable if they're heading over to it together as a teammate group. We'll also be working with OSC to train Stedward Bear families and friends as swim meet officials in preparation for 2 competitions that we're looking to host within the next couple of years. Through these initiatives, we're really looking to gain some independence and credibility within the swimming and the paraswimming community.
Thanks, Jessica. So, like from the OSC side of the fence, it's very similar to what Jessica just said. We need to carefully consider the social context and the training context when athletes are integrated into specific groups. And this may take a little bit more dialogue with the family of a paraswimmer and the staff at the Stedward Center, and maybe even some volunteers, and a little bit more care than we would take when we do group movements within our club for able-bodied swimmers. And again, we need to support the Stedward Center by providing them with key officials and perhaps some officials training opportunities as they look to host local, provincial, and national competitions.
So we'll each just leave you with a couple of tips to sum up some of our experiences. One would be always keep the lines of communication open. I mentioned that we had a little bit of a rocky start with the initial individual we had in the head coach position. And at that time, a lot of the swimmers on the team didn't feel aware or weren't comfortable to get in touch with the leadership. So as a result, we didn't hear about a lot of the things that were occurring until several months into the start of the swim season. So just really being open and communicating and explicitly stating to people how they can get in touch with you and that they're always welcome to get in touch with you with feedback. Don't be afraid to work with an organization that has different administrative processes or expectations than yours does. And patience is always going to be a huge factor. There will be roadblocks, there will be obstacles, there's going to be challenges along the way. Just having patience and communicating and a willingness to work together to get around those obstacles is going to be very important in forming a new partnership.
Okay, tips from my side of the fence. So as Jessica said, we really need to maximize, if we're going to communicate to any athletes that they have specific options that they're going to choose from for training, such as integration, it has to be communicated well and it needs to be, I guess, explained why there are benefits to choosing that type of programming, and she also said that that was not done as effectively as we would have liked it to have been, and that had a negative impact on our experience. So really communicating that clearly is important. Next, sport has to be fun and engaging. People need to have their social needs considered and most of the time met when they're participating in sport, or regardless of the quality of the training program or the level of performance, it will be something that probably the athletes end up making changes. Next, I think one of the most important things that OSC has done is we were able to get our board to approve the prorating of fees for para-athletes. So this kind of addresses what was discussed in the previous group. We need to make sure when offering parasport opportunities that they are cost effective and that they're not outrageous, but at the same time that sport is an adventure that needs to be paid for. So it would be totally unfair for us to charge athletes to train 6 times a week when they're only going to train 1 or 2 times a week. Even though we have some members in our swim club that pay for 6 times a week and only show up twice a week. So we need to make sure that we're charging appropriately to make sure that our transaction with para-athletes and their families is equitable. I guess the last comment I have is just being realistic about potential integration contexts. So it's okay to try, it's okay to see if a certain setting is effective or not for an individual and a coach, and for even 2 different programs to work together and organizations. But sometimes it's not going to work, and that doesn't mean the structure isn't right. So, we need to be realistic about that. And Julia, maybe you could put your hand up. If anybody has any questions for Julia, who's the head coach of the Stedford Bears at any point, feel free to approach her later. Nancy, I think that's it from us.
I don't think I fully realized the opportunity facilitating presented because I have another question. So I was really curious when you were talking about supporting athlete integration, because in my experience, sometimes parasport programs are looked at as stepping stone programs to more mainstream sport, as if there's sort of a hierarchy happening there, and that we want to encourage all athletes to integrate because that's going to be better for them. But I'm wondering if you can talk about, you alluded to this in your last comment, the idea that it might not always work, but that we might not always necessarily have that as our end goal, that maybe the goal is participation in sport and versus integration, although I'm appreciating the collaboration. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the tension around that idea that there might be a hierarchy happening there and that integration in certain ways may not be a positive for some people. If you can speak a little bit more to that.
Would you like to take this question? Okay.
Sorry.
No.
Okay.
Okay. So one of the positives we discussed was the potential for an increased frequency and intensity of basically physiological training stimulus. So athletes could, by swimming more and at a higher intensity, become fitter. But if it's not a good fit, not like fit, if it's not a good social fit, or if the athlete's needs are not met, then more is certainly not better. So I would say that, having worked with some of the athletes from the Stedford Bears, there are certainly a number of swimmers that are not interested in integration, do not feel comfortable with integration, and I don't think that would be a good idea for them. I also think it becomes even more complex when you look at specific athletes' abilities and specific classifications that athletes hold. And so we know from working with different levels of impairment and different classes in swimming that some athletes with different types of impairments may optimize their training at, say, 4 times a week, which is something that the Stedford Center currently offers. And if they did more, they would be unreasonably fatigued and not have a good experience and not become fitter. So I think it needs to be done with care, and that particularly there are certain people that would not benefit from integration. One thing we probably could improve upon is if the Stedford Center offered maybe 5 or 6 swims per week, then I would be saying even more that integration should be done for a select few. Because once you get kind of to that threshold in our sport for about 10 months of the year, you're covering your bases pretty well.
And then I'll ask you both one last question. If you could imagine your sport differently, what would be a key piece to that in terms of collaboration, in terms of parasport, in terms of the 51%, all of those kinds of things? Is there something in particular that you would imagine differently that would be really positive?
It's a tough question. I would imagine a world, to be honest, similar to what Nathan just said, where you could access 6 swims a meet through the university and be more of a standalone kind of a program. I think that partnerships and collaborations are always going to be important. I think it's really important for a select few, definitely. But I would love to see parasport grow to a point where they are fully sustaining teams. Does that make sense?
I'll tack on. I know one of the challenges we face in Alberta is that sometimes swim clubs do not see integration or even supporting paraswimmers at any level to be something that is financially viable. And that is not a respectful thing, but at the end of the day, we're limited in the space we have and the cost. So if I could change the sport, it would be so that we have less restrictions on facility access, specific times where we can access the facilities, not just the number of lanes we have in total, and the attitude that we have to be pursuing profit in everything that we do. We need to be providing quality programming, and we're actually defined as a non-for-profit. So people need to think that through a little bit.
Great. Thank you both very much. So now we're going to move on to talking about skiing, and joining us are Michael Neary, who's the para-lead for Cross Country Ski Alberta, and Amy McKinnon, the Executive Director for Paralympic Sports Association. Welcome. And I'll do this. So this group actually has their own series of slides that they'll describe along with their presentation.
So welcome. Actually, before we get started, I just kind of want to get a sense for who's in the room. So how many people are students? And how many are in the adapted sport world? Okay, anybody from PSOs? And who's from outside of Edmonton? Okay, thanks. That's just very selfish. I just wanted to know. So Mike and I have been working together for quite a few years, and I should probably back up a little bit. And explain that our relationship has sort of endured different organizations. I started with the Canadian Paraplegic Association, which is now Spinal Cord Injury Alberta, and that's where this program began. And so now I'm with the Paralympic Sports Association. So when I started with PSA, we brought the program with us, but the relationship has pretty much endured. You want to talk about yourself?
Yeah, actually, the relationship we started with PSA actually was in 2011, as Amy mentioned. I know with Cross Country Alberta, we started getting involved around 2006. Before that, in regards to specifically as a provincial organization, the Alberta Sport had brought in, and Canadian Sport had brought in Parasport for Canada Winter Games. So that was kind of our initial process with that. And myself, I've been coaching for close to 30 years myself, but involved with para for about 13 years in coaching, so a bit of the background there, but we did notice that we definitely needed more connections and partnerships and numbers and grassroots and all that kind of scenario. So after the 2011 season, that's where we had some contact with PSA to do basic learn to ski clinics and that kind of scenario.
So from our perspective, we started a variety of programs, so not just cross-country ski, but working with people who had spinal cord injury and still have a spinal cord injury. I realized that there was a lack of sort of adventure, outdoor recreation activities in the Edmonton area, and so that's where we connected with Cross Country Alberta and said, you know, how can we work together, which has been great, obviously. Technology is not our strong point, but we can run programs. So this slide here, we're just going to describe this for anybody who is visually impaired. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. Oh, I'm not describing that anymore. 5 people, all sit skiing.
4 people and me.
4 people and you, that's right. And Mike is there as well. All women, 1 child, Mike, and they are all white, unfortunately. Let's click to the next slide. Okay, so with respect to logistics, so Paralympic Sports Association sort of provides the knowledge and experience working with people with a variety of abilities and conditions, knowing what they might need, what considerations need to be given over to Mike. So for example, we might scope out a particular location to determine whether it will be suitable for somebody who uses a manual chair, someone who has limited upper body function. We might also provide information on the participants, because the participants will come largely from our organization, and or if they don't, we often know who they are. So information on, what they might need in terms of volunteer assistance, who might need to take a break and come in and warm up, equipment that's going to work for each individual, and so on. The other thing that Mike and I talked about was pool noodles and duct tape. So prior to us working with them, they had no idea about pool noodles and duct tape, which maybe a little bit. Okay, so which is sort of essential in the adapted world. It helps you fit things when they don't fit on the fly. And then we provide resources. So obviously, us in the adapted industry, we have our own kind of sets of grants and funding and things like that we can access that Cross Country Alberta might not be aware of. So we've done that, and we've also applied jointly together. We also have knowledge of other adapted sports, materials that could be transferable. So as an example, Mike was able to make use of some information we gave him about adapted kayaking equipment that he's now using for sit skiing, as it works quite well. So we have access to people who want adapted programming, right? That's what we do, and so they come to us for that, and so we can feed them right into a Paranordic skiing program. We also have connections with other disability organizations, other adapted sport organizations, and we can use them to promote the program and to recruit. And then with respect to staff and volunteers, so obviously our staff have the knowledge on how to adapt activities. They're also there and they know the people who are in our programs. So often people will feel more comfortable coming out if they know someone that's going to be there. They have that trust that the staff and volunteers that are there are going to know about what they're going to need in terms of adaptation. So we bring all of that.
Sure. I was going to just mention initially, back when we started Paranordic, there was no infrastructure. We didn't have any equipment, as we talked about down there with 4 chairs and things, but that was my initial plan, to develop infrastructure. So when you get a phone call, perhaps, from somebody who'd like to go try skiing, we would say, that's a great idea, come back later. But so that was my initial process with different grants, programs. I think now we have about 16 different sit skis and equipment for visually impaired, and some for amputee, but our programs actually started down in Calgary through clubs, which we tried to integrate through the clubs. Edmonton eventually came later, and we've had now people around the province from High Level and Rocky Lane and Okotoks and Stettler and Grand Prairie, but those are individuals, and we're trying to develop and then these partnerships again with multi-sport programs or infrastructure, I guess, in the communities to help out. But when I was joke about equipment, you never know the size of the person or what they're going to fit or what they might need, what specific equipment. So that's where the duct tape does come in. But initially, even purchasing equipment was ridiculously hard to do. Now we have a local fellow who actually can build anything we want, from recreational to world-class equipment. So that's been quite helpful, and trying to develop with facilities locally as well. But back to the PSA partnership, the volunteers' knowledge and experience that they have, we can provide the equipment and expertise and the coaching. And the initial programs were about 6 to 8 week learn to ski programs. locally, and we'd put in little fun events if people want to participate. So not huge numbers, but I think the largest we had was about a dozen people participating, where if I go back to when I first started, and actually they mentioned down at the beginning, it's the ex-chair of the organization, Tony. He was the only person we had. So 10 or 12 people was statistically 12% or 12 times larger than when we started. So, so yeah, that's why these partnerships are excellent that way. So, do you want the next slide?
Yeah, let's be really clear. So PSA doesn't know anything about cross-country skiing. I don't know anything about cross-country skiing. So there's no way we could run a cross-country ski program if we hadn't have made this partnership.
She's not in any of the pictures, I noticed.
So this picture here is, we've got 4 skiers on sit skis. We've got, 6 people in the background. I think we have 1 or 2 visually impaired skiers as well. Mix of participants, Mike, and volunteers.
And from that, actually, again, I initially started these learn to ski programs. Was the piece, and then some people, usually once a year, would end up wanting to compete. So you'd have like the competitive programs, but we also ended up with sort of the Active for Life piece. But in this particular photo, in the red jacket, that's a gentleman who's gone on to be an Olympic athlete. On the far right, she's been a national champion. So they just started, hey, I want to try skiing. Other ones, everyone has their different goals, as we mentioned. We've had other people who just want to ski with their children. So they get out and take part, and now the whole family can go. But again, the equipment was always the hard part. Where do you find it? So anyway, you're next.
So with respect to training and development, it was very informal. So there's no real formal training for either party in terms of the integration piece. It's really, from our perspective, all about an increase in comfort level. We hear this over and over and over again, that often for those who don't work with people who have a disability, the biggest barrier is just becoming comfortable working with that person and asking them questions and figuring out what they need. And so often once you get that, once they just get used to being around and talking with and asking questions, then they can take it from there, and there's not a lot of training that needs to happen after that. So with the disability-specific knowledge, Mike was able to acquire that through working with us and with all of the participants and their different needs. He gained a lot of inclusion experience and was able to pass that on.
As mentioned, we're a provincial organization, so around the province, but so it's interesting that, again, we've had I don't love too many stories, but a gentleman moved into Edmonton, wanted to get involved in skiing, phoned about 4 or 5 different sport organizations, and he used to be quite a competitive national level swimmer. He's visually impaired now. He told me years later the only reason he actually skied was I was the only sport to call him back. So you're like, oh, wow, that's a great recruitment tool. But he did initially contact the local clubs, and when they found out he was visually impaired, they didn't know quite what to do besides, here, phone this organization, hopefully they can help you. So that is true that it shouldn't be any different, but so he's gone on and he's done multi-sport. So that's one thing that we've had involved with different sports, not just skiing itself, but cycling's been a big one. Had some connection with sledge hockey. A little more challenging as it's winter. It's a triathlon, hand cycling, swimming. So we're talking about different audiences. We do work with our national organization, try to do with the clubs. Our biggest resource we're missing is the volunteers and people in the communities, for sure. Because that is what I feel tough about when I do get a phone call from Rocky Lane, Alberta, with a junior high school kid who wants to take part in the ski program. Can we help? Yes, I'm able to send equipment, but there's not like full programs, but it's nice that he can go out with the school. This is happening quite a bit around the province. I think now we have 9 different pieces of equipment at different schools for kids that just want to take part, as opposed to we've had other ones where they're sitting in the corner watching and not realizing they can take part. But so it's a different audiences perhaps between the 2 groups we have, but there's a lot of similarities. And we've had some people just show up to some of our clinics. They saw their notes on their advertisements of a program. They're not actually a member of, say, PSA. and they just sort of showed up because they saw it somehow. So that's what the social media can be quite beneficial. But
So, yeah, so this picture is, we'll talk a little bit about Derek in a bit, but he's someone who started out in our programs and is now at the Paralympic level.
he is actually, he was also, he was actually a hand cyclist who was training for, out of Calgary. His coach was training for the Paralympic Games in Toronto, or what is it? I should know the answer here. Pan Am Games in Toronto. Wanted to take up cross training, didn't do it for a few years, then eventually his coach Steve convinced him to do skiing as a cross training. Within less than a year, he seemed to then become a skier, cross training with cycling, but we don't look at that as taking away from another sport. He realized he didn't think he'd actually like skiing, but he did. And he's developed quite a bit in the last 4 years. He did just compete in Korea, always on the cusp of the team the last 3 years. This year, huge breakthroughs, top Canadian in a number of World Cups before he went to Korea. He's still young in the international sport, but yeah, he's from a small town, Smoky Lake, Alberta. But it's just interesting. It's been a good partnership with all these other different groups, especially the winter and the summer piece with cycling. Because we have other athletes from cycling who still train in the summer, and plus they also do the winter competition. So, but that's, I can tell you about his very first race, but we won't talk about that.
So with recruitment and referral, so we've talked a little bit about this already. Various connections that both of our organizations have help to really bring in more people than we could individually. Also, we can often recruit from other adapted sports, and that's the perfect example, right? So somebody who started out in cycling might actually be interested in something different, but didn't have the opportunity to try that. Also, other opportunities we have is because we have connections with the adapted sport world and the teams, and we run a bunch of other programs, not just cross-country skiing. We can organize, you know, sort of a try it for that particular group. I mean, the sledge hockey group often likes to stay together with their friends, that kind of thing. So this could be sort of a team builder for that group and a way for them to try another activity. And as I mentioned, you know, we have a lot of connections with disability organizations, and in fact, the program actually started with a disability organization. We also have a lot of connections with healthcare. So the local rehab hospitals, rec therapists, physiotherapists, OTs, that kind of thing. And that's sort of that's a connection that CCA wouldn't necessarily have, but helps to bring in people from all areas.
It is interesting to talk about the different communities or connections that we may have, but we do have big school programs within our organization. It's for anybody, but one of the particular programs, mostly participation of First Nation, and it's close to 6,000 kids take part. The very first few years, we actually never even thought about it, I guess, or asked the question. It was one little other story. We happened to get a grant for underrepresented populations. Talking to a principal of the school, mentioned about para, and she said, wait, you can actually ski if you're in a wheelchair? It's like, yes. She had an 11-year-old girl who was told at a previous school by a phys ed teacher, you can't do sports in a wheelchair. But we was just chatting away, and this is now, well, it was 6 years ago, but shocked me. So they said, well, how are we gonna do this? I just took equipment up, and it's interesting to see the change within 3 months. And then the school purchased her own equipment. Now she's in high school, but 3 months later, just the interaction between her and her schoolmates, where she used to sit in the corner, watch them every Tuesday go ski. So the next year, we've been doing this program for 10 years, we just started asking the question, is there anyone, we come in and do a school program, anyone need? And all of a sudden, some schools would say, no, we do have a special class, but you don't need to because we don't know if you can handle that, to the point of, yes, we can. We have lots of equipment, lots of expertise, lots of people. And it was pretty cool just to, everyone in the whole school can be participating, it doesn't matter. So it's word include I use as well, but sometimes you get resistance, it seems. I know occupational therapists sometimes get nervous with certain questions about, are you certified, can you do this? But the one particular one on visually impaired, a young boy, the tracks are actually perfect in skiing because he could feel them with his feet. was actually a perfect opportunity, a perfect sport, and it was cool. They didn't initially want him to, but his parents did. He wanted to. And this little grin perked up on his face every stride he took. And he had helpers on either side of him, but yeah, the actual skiing with the tracks was very, very cool. So we do a lot of school programs, and we're just trying to ask people, if you need anything, just ask us, and we can try to make sure it happens. So. What's that?
Picture.
Oh, no. Oh, explain this picture?
Yeah.
Is that Lori?
I think it's Liz.
This actually individual was one that was one of the first people to contact us. Double amputee, car accident. Used to ski before her accident, and her whole goal was to, again, ski with her 2 daughters. She did try to ski with the prosthetic leg standing and wasn't working out very well, hurt herself quite badly. So her equipment she tried initially was terrible, but within 3 years and new grants, I don't know, I took a picture, she fell down, but better equipment for her, it was fun to see. She went out to a local center here and skied with her daughters and husband regularly, and it was just kind of cool. Did some fun competitions as well, but this was like, again, her goal was no different than anybody else's goals. It was hers, and was able to accomplish it. Oh, you can't? Oh, is that those guys?
What?
There we go. She's just sideways on the, we're just talking about, but that's happened numerous times, and other particular ones. Gentleman on the right, I mean, we can't really see it that well, but the one racer, that's Derek, but the gentleman on the right was from St. Albert. He was kind of cool because he actually quadriplegic, operated his wheelchair just with a mouthpiece. I had to push him in all the events we did, which was fine, and he smoked, which he'd light up afterwards. I was exhausted, but his favorite, well, I know, it's kind of weird, but his favorite quote was, "It's just nice to know I can do something." We did the local Birkebinder event. The media picked up on it, interviewed him, which is cool. His relatives in Arizona saw the piece, and I didn't know Arizona followed ski races from Edmonton. But he was involved for a number of years until, unfortunately, the funding for his recreation transportation disappeared, and then he couldn't come out anymore. But we had specific equipment designed just for him, so we could actually go out. A number of other people have used it now, but it was just a cool quote. Well, again, I laughed that he smoked, and I was the guy tired, but. So just interesting stories, but it is a good quote. I still always remember that.
Go back.
Oh.
So Mike's messing up my slides. He's talking about the success stories too early. But anyway, so the one on the left here is Derek. This is a good success story. So Mike kind of already introduced him and his journey, but I'll introduce sort of the beginning part of his journey. So because I worked for a disability organization at that time, he was actually my client when he was first injured and was not interested in sport or anything like that. And so we got him initially involved in cycling, and he was a little apprehensive about that. And like we said, then he moved over to cross-country skiing. But in speaking with his parents, after he was traveling the world and on the national team and things like that, it was really interesting because I'd known them for quite a few years. And his involvement, getting involved in this program, really catapulted his whole life, right? So he went back to school, he got a vehicle, he started dating again, he gained a lot of confidence, and just everything he learned from sport, but also what came from it. So traveling around the world, being exposed to new people was really great for him. And he's so he's obviously gotten a lot more out of it than just actual sport. So for the takeaways, Stephanie mentioned earlier about trust and relationships. And from our perspectives, the relationships are key. So as we mentioned, the relationship has endured different employers. Mike has a different opportunity now. I moved from a disability organization over to PSA, but the relationship has endured, and so has the program. People in this industry don't leave. So for all of you students, if you're in this industry, these are the people you're going to work with for the rest of your lives. So be friends with them and don't burn bridges, and because these are the types of partnerships you're going to have, right? So I would say, especially for the students, because I know there were quite a few students in this room, do a few things at this conference. So make sure you get people's cards. If you have a card, give it out to people, and just make connections, because you never know in the future where those connections are going to go. Often it takes years and years and years to realize how you can partner or how your skills sets can fit together. I know we have other partnerships with other PSOs that we've known them for years, and we never could quite figure out how we could work together, but we're realizing that now. The other takeaway from our perspective is that able-bodied sport is actually interested in parasport, right? So we've seen it on the panel, and I think sometimes from the able-bodied perspective, we think, the PSOs that deal with able-bodied sport wouldn't be interested in parasport, or it's a lot of work, or that kind of thing. But my experience is it's been the exact opposite. Often they want to get involved and they're not quite sure how. And so if we're able to come in and say, hey, we've got this expertise, we have these people, but we don't really know anything about cross-country skiing, can you help us with that? They will jump at that opportunity, because that's what they need. They need the people, and they need the para expertise.
I guess I get the last word, but in regards to the building the relationships, that's a key part of me for anything we do in work. But initially, you need the trust. You need to build a relationship with a group, an organization, a person, an athlete, a coach. And generally, once you get, and we also need the infrastructure and things, but once you get that trust, then you get the buy-in, and once the buy-in happens, it's usually quite simple. So exactly what you mentioned with trust and building those partnerships and relationships. So I think we might have one last one, but no, we don't. There you go.
Great. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think some things that jump out at me are, when we're talking about collaboration, Jen spoke about, some of the financial challenges. And then our second group talked about integration, and that's actually can be a pretty complicated thing. The reliance on volunteers and these kinds of things, but what resonates really strongly is the idea that collaboration can provide access when it's done well. And so I think that's one of the benefits that I really see coming through all of the things that people talked about. In different ways, it can provide access. I want to open it up for any questions from the floor as well. So does anybody have a question for anyone on the panel? Yeah, Kirsty.
Can you hear me? Okay, there. So my question is for mostly Nathan and Jessica, but if anyone else wants to answer, feel free. I find with collaborating within the community, it is quite dependent on the people involved in the organizations. And so from Olympian Swim Club's perspective, Nathan, if you were not to be there anymore, do you feel that this is a sustainable partnership and that it would continue to provide this programming to para-athletes? And then my second question would be around coaching. So has there been a lot of buy-in from the mainstream coaches to support para-athletes? And is there education for them to learn about the best ways to support the athletes?
Perhaps can you hear me? Oh, yeah, okay. Can our partnership survive staff transitions? That was the first question. I think that in this case, we have developed an infrastructure and a normalcy with what we've developed. So I hope that whenever the staff transition on my side of the fence at OSC or at the Stedward Center, that our relationship can continue. It will likely to be redefined somewhat, but I'll just briefly, in a swim club structure, the coaching staff and the head coach report directly to a board of directors, and so at the moment our board of directors is very supportive of this part of our programming. So I would believe that if a transition happened in the near future, we would be able to maintain that. I can speak to coaching, or would you like to? Okay, so definitely we have interest from our OSC coaches that coach full-time and have done so for 20 plus years, that kind of thing. But where they lack confidence is they don't have direct experience working with para-athletes, and there are not a ton of practical coach education and coach development opportunities in swimming. I've seen some specific tools from Swimming Canada. We have recently, Kevin Dennis from Swim Alberta is really working to connect the para coaches in the province so that we have more of a dialogue amongst each other. They certainly, as a PSO, do really well at trying to connect us to the right people and to Swimming Canada, who manages a lot of para swimming. But from the day-to-day coaching processes that happen, I think our coaches would benefit from a little bit more. So it's certainly a challenge, but there's interest. It's just like everybody said, like the able-bodied sports side wants to work with parasport and develop parasport. I see that every day.
Anyone else want to respond as well? No? Okay. Yes, Lindsay.
Given our first panel was all disabled athletes and administrators and stuff, and this panel is
Not.
largely humans and working in mainstream and disability service organizations, what kind of mentorship do you have beyond the volunteer opportunity for? Hello. What kind of opportunities do you have for mentorship, for disabled leadership, for folks to be involved not only in disability service organizations, but potentially in mainstream service organizations as well? Because I think if we're actually going to take David's comment about the 51% seriously, we need to be looking at who's in leadership and what kinds of mentorship programs we have, so we're not accessing free labor from disabled people to make our organizations valid and valuable to disability communities. So yeah, I'm just curious about what kinds of opportunities you have for meaningful leadership for disabled folks in your organizations.
I can take that. So at the Stedward Center, we do rely really heavily on volunteers to run the majority of our programs. We see about 250 student volunteers come through the center each year, in addition to paid instructors and coaches and full-time staff members. I think that we could definitely do a better job of actively recruiting individuals who experience disability into some of those volunteer positions. That is sort of a stepping stone. A lot of our staff members previously volunteered or were practicum students with the center and grew into those positions. With our summer camps coming up this summer, we have actually hired one individual who is an athlete on our paraswimming team. So we are seeing a little bit of growth, and we're offering a paid position to one of the athletes to kind of grow her experience and into a role hopefully as a future coach or leader in the future. Does that answer your question? Okay.
And maybe I'll just speak a little bit from Paralympic Sports Association perspective as well. I agree with you, and it's actually always a struggle for us to get, some of our members to be more involved on our boards, inter programs, that kind of thing. So personally, I'm very encouraged to see people like Geneva and people like Sierra and Adam who are in kinesiology right now and have a disability, right? So for me, that's awesome, because we know that in order to have really good quality sport programs, we do need people who have the background, right? They have the education, they have the knowledge, they've taken the coaching training, that kind of thing. And so to see that people are interested, and it's not just us trying to say like, please be interested, right? Come work for our organization, that they are actually taking that role on themselves is super encouraging, because, I've often said for myself, like, I have no business running PSA, right? I'm just a white woman without a disability. So what do I know, right? I just have an interest. It would be much better if we could see, the people who are in our programs actually move up and eventually be the program coordinators and the executive director of Paralympic sports. So that's a first step. So congratulations to all of you who are actually taking that step. And then from our perspective, I mean, we do try, of course, just like the Stedward Center, we can do a better job. Everyone can always do a better job of doing this, but we do try to get people who, you know, have grown up in our programs to become the coaches and move on and be the future leaders, right? But more work to do.
I don't have much to add to that. I think we are such a small organization as well. It'd be awesome for me to just hire 3 more people and get that experience and that representation. But we introduced like sport directors, I think is what we called them on our board of directors, and the representation there is athletes, which is nice. So having that as part of our leadership and our guiding force.
Thank you very much to our panel. If anyone else has additional questions for them, please find them afterward. I guess as a parting word thought wondering from me is I think Lindsay's question is really important. I think it's one that we probably have heard before and resonates in our minds. And one of the points of these next 2 days is to actually put into practice that which we already are questioning and to create change. So I think it's really important that we don't just ask those questions, but we actually figure out ways in practice to start making those changes. So lunchtime is now. It's a 45-minute lunch, and food is just behind me over there. So I hope you like it, which would be good. But then we're just back here in 45 minutes, so it's a short lunch time for today. Thank you very much, everyone.